Hi, welcome to this overview of Irish habitats and their species. I'm going to concentrate on three main groupings. So grasslands, woodlands, peatlands, heathlands, and mention hedgerows and tree lines. These are the types or groupings of habitats that you're going to come across in the acre scoring system. And I want you to have a little understanding of what causes them to occur and what impacts on them. And here, typical West of Ireland landscape, you have lots of habitats that are interacting together to form that wider landscape. And when we look at FOSSET, so FOSSET being the Irish Habitat Classification Guide, generally divided into six main groupings. So we're going to concentrate on woodland, peatland and grassland. Heather has given you a separate lecture there on water, and we'll touch on coastal and built ground at some stage in the future. But it's also really important to remember that whilst we might try and define a grassland from a scrub, from a heathland, nature tends to do its own thing, and it tends to do mosaics quite well. So in this habitat mosaic, this is a piece of land in County Leitrim, very wet grassland, which then transitions into something called a poor fens. That fen, if you stood on there, well, you wouldn't be standing there for very long, you would have sank through the ground. And then you can move up to scrub and dry heat on that drier bank up there. So again, habitats exist, generally speaking, in habitat mosaics where they're mixed together. But what we're going to try and do now is we're going to concentrate on main groupings that you'll come across, and the first being grasslands. And on the right-hand side, you can see a beautiful grassland with ragged robin there in the foreground. Lots of different types of grasses that are present as well. So grasslands dominated by grasses, along with other forbs or herbaceous plants that grow hand in hand with the management, which tends to be grazing or mowing. And in this series of photographs, what I want to do is I want to take you through characteristics of natural, semi-natural, semi-improved and improved. There are very few places in the world which have natural grasslands. Natural grassland means grassland that isn't going to move to being scrub or woodland if you left it to its own devices. So you can see there from the draft, this isn't in Ireland, this is more in Africa. And then the other three pictures relate to Ireland. What we want to pick up with the acre scoring system are these semi-natural grasslands. So these grasslands are maintained by management. So it could be cows, or it could be mowing, it could be sheep, horses, whatever livestock that are there. But generally they have very low to no inputs of inorganic nutrients. They would of course have organic nutrients from the livestock if they're present. And you can see there from the large amount of ragged robin, this one's quite species rich. And those are the ones in the acre scoring system that should be scoring higher. So these semi-natural grasslands are important. They're disappearing, they're under threat. This particular type here from drainage. We then move to semi-improved grasslands. So semi-improved grasslands, there you can see the tractor and the NPK have gone up in size. It's just to indicate more management, more inputs. They may still hold on to some species, but not at the cover that they would have been in that semi-natural grassland. And finally, we end up with the improved grasslands. So the improved grasslands will be lacking those indicators that you have in the acre scoring system. They are maybe, grazed more intensively, silage is taken off maybe twice a year, and you've got higher inputs of inorganic nutrients coming into the system. Productivity being the main outcome there, ecosystem service, and for that then your trade-off is plant species diversity. And if we're to look at grassland, there are a few different things that really impact on what we see in front of us in terms of plant species present. The amount of water precipitation that's falling, generally in the west of Ireland, it's going to be wetter than it is in the east of Ireland. Wet grasslands tend to occur more frequently in the west of Ireland. That's also then related to the geology and soils. So we have, more peat and more clay-based soils here that tend to hold on to the water quite readily and don't release it, and that ends up with pooling or ponding. pH and geology go hand in hand with that. So geology, underlying geology, being very important for determining the type of grassland, particularly say something like calcareous grasslands, which really depend on limestone being present in the locality. Your management history, whether you're grazing it or it's been cut as meadow. Remember the marsh artillery butterfly, they tend to be associated with grazing or pasture, not so much meadow. And nutrient status, so whether you're putting in nutrients or it's free from nutrients, that can give you an indication as to the type of species that you're going to find and be present in your grassland. And it's important to remember that the grasslands that we see in Ireland, these temperate grasslands, they're on their way to succeed towards woodland and scrub, or scrub and woodland. So to keep them as grassland, you do need intervention, and that's a very important point to get across, I suppose, to farmers, that their role in maintaining species-rich semi-natural grassland, semi-improved grassland, is very important, and it's key to those plant species, those indicator species being present. So taking the habitat classification in Fawcett, there are 6 main classifications for grassland, 7 really, but the one that we're not going to concentrate on here is improved grassland, because that won't be showing up in the acre scoring system. The others will, so from dry grassland, dry meadows, acid grassland, wet grassland, and freshwater marsh, any of those will have species that are occurring on that acre scoring system. So just to give you an insight into which of those grasslands you tend to expect to find more often, the Irish Semi-Natural Grassland Survey was carried out, I think, from 2007 to 2012, and that was a real attempt at trying to understand what type of grasslands do we have in Ireland. So those semi-natural grasslands, the ones that have lower levels of nutrient input, lower level or more extensive management. And when you look at that, 55% of the time you're going to come across a wet grassland. So wet grasslands, Ireland, it's a damp place, you're going to come across wet grasslands, and lower amounts of the other grasslands. So GSI there means semi-improved grasslands. So grasslands that hold a few indicator species that you find in acres, but not many. And then we have your GS1, which is calcareous grassland, GS2 hay meadow, GS3 acid grassland. And here GM1 is your marsh, and that's only a small proportion of the Irish Grassland Survey. Most of the grasslands that the surveyors visited were grazed, and cattle and sheep being the 2 dominant types of grazers. So if we're to look at wet grassland, wet grassland isn't all the same. There's lots of variations in wet grassland. You've seen this picture before, so this wet grassland meadow, that was mown regularly, believe it or not, or mown annually, and that kind of, I suppose, very uniform look to the top level of the flowers is very characteristic of meadow. And then you see something here in the opposite corner, which is this very much grazed wet grassland that's going into heath and scrub, so that mosaic. This is a very difficult grassland to manage by grazing, but they have grazed on this very extensively, but very wet ground. On the right hand side here we have moderately species-rich wet grassland. It's managed as meadow with aftermath grazing, and you can see they're divided up by hedgerows. And in the bottom left hand corner there, this wet grassland is dominated by rushes. There's a few species. It's maybe could be topped or have other management interventions that might help bring up the species richness. So not all wet grasslands are the same, and your acre scoring system will be trying to pick up the ones that have been managed more optimally for species, for the wide range of species, and ones that are not giving you that optimal range of species. This beautiful dry hay meadow was down in South County Leitrim. When I walked in there, it was just full of all of the species you could expect to find in a dry hay meadow. And of course, remember, dry ground is relatively rare, and especially in County Leitrim. And to get a dry hay meadow like this is very, very important. So hay meadows like this are Annex 1 habitat types. So Annex 1 habitat types being listed in the Habitats Directive, and these are very important to maintain and retain. A lot of these tend to get over-fertilised. That's the main risk to them. So 6% of the grasslands in the Irish, so ISNGS means Irish Semi-Natural Grassland Survey, only 6% are these beautiful hay meadows, and there's been a huge loss of this type of habitat in the last while, and we're continuing to lose them at a rapid rate. Some of the species that you might expect to find in there, so these are your positive indicator species. In this particular grassland, it was full of hay rattle or yellow rattle. So called because when you pick it up, when it's in seed, you can actually rattle it and hear it rattle. So this is what's called a semi-parasitic plant. So it makes some food itself, but it also feeds off the roots of grasses, which keeps down the competition from grasses, meaning that maybe farmers aren't so happy sometimes with this plant. They'd like to take that off and have more grasses. And when you do that, you're going to lose the cover of that particular plant. Next to that was the oxeye daisy, so member of the daisy family, and you'll be looking at your plant e-portfolio and be trying to identify and take pictures of oxeye daisy. So oxeye daisy is a very good indicator of these lovely species-rich hay meadows. And you can also find things like orchids as well. And orchids tend not to, this particular orchid tends to like more neutral soils, and it's found there. You can see the hay rattle in the background. So if I was to describe hay meadows, well drained, moderate fertility, maintained by annual mowing, and those together keep these species assemblage in place. And then we come to calcareous grassland. So this calcareous grassland, again, is from County Leitrim. A lot of my pictures are. And so again, just to tell you, you can get dry grasslands occurring in wetter locations like Leitrim. And that's why the range of acres scoring system goes from grassland indicators that are from the wettest to the driest type of habitats. You can see there the typical rocky outcrop. The soils are very thin, well drained, and generally have a neutral to alkaline pH. And some of the typical species are these beautiful harebells, which you'll get a little bit later in the season, lady's mantle and eyebrights. Now you'll get these in other situations as well, but the co-occurrence of these together tends to indicate calcareous grassland. So that's leaving grasslands behind. I haven't done acid grassland. We'll come back to that at some stage. But let's look at woodland. So this woodland here is a semi-natural woodland. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's have a look at this landscape view. So there's three different types of woodland happening here. So this is plantation woodland. So it's a crop. It's put in there as a monospecies or a small number of species. This is semi-natural woodland. So it's woodland that has developed with native species. It hosts or can host a lot of native fauna as well. And then we have something like this, which is hedgerows that are extending into grasslands beside them. They're maybe gone past the width that you would call it a hedgerow, and they're forming kind of small linear patches of woodland. In Ireland, only 11% of our landmass is woodland, or is characterised as woodland, and that includes plantation woodland and semi-natural woodland. And there's a wonderful document called the Irish or Daffin Forest Statistics Ireland, and this is from 2022. So I just went in there and I took some statistics out just to give you an overview of woodland. So nearly 70% of the forest area in Ireland is conifer forest, and Sitka spruce taking up 50% of that area. Less than 20% is broadleaf forest, and most trees are less than 30 years old. So it really gives you an insight into, I suppose, the amount of stocked forest, conifer forest plantation that we have. Leitrim has the highest percentage of forest cover, and Cork has the highest forest area. Again, using Fawcett, there are a number of different types of woodlands that are semi-natural, so not the plantation forest. They go from everything that has oak and ash. They tend to be the drier ones. Yew forest is really only found in a few places down in the southeast, but it can form part of other woodlands. We can get wetter forests or wetter woodlands, so wet oak, riparian woodlands, wet willow and bog woodlands. Those would have higher water levels and species that could indicate a little bit of marshy conditions as well. In woodlands, the idea that canopy is really important. So the canopy layer, what forms the top woodland layer? and that really dictates what happens underneath. In a woodland, you could potentially identify 4 different types of layers. So the canopy, the understory, the field layer, and the ground layer. And if you have all of those present, generally speaking, you've got a nice semi-natural woodland. And the tree canopy is doing a really important job. So with sunshine, if we rarely see it, but sometimes there is sunshine, the canopy is absorbing as much of that as possible. And it's also reflecting back energy, which means by the time sun hits the floor of the woodland, you're not getting direct sunlight, you're getting sun flecks. You're also getting interception of water, and you're getting a decrease of temperature. So the plants that live underneath that tree canopy are really adapted to lower shade, less amount of water, and to periodic bursts of, I suppose, seasonal bursts of more sunshine and more light coming in on top of them. Hedgerows and tree lines, we have limited enough information across the country on, I suppose, the extent of these, but what we can think of them as a connected highway. So they're going to connect maybe areas of scrub and woodland, grassland, etc. to each other. And here we have a tree line. So a tree line in the fossil classification is trees that are in a linear row less than 4 meters wide, and they're greater than 4 meters in height. Here we have a hedgerow. A hedgerow is less than 4 meters in height, and again it's linear and it's taken up less than 4 meters width. And of course you have other things, like you have boundaries that are just post-wire fencing, and you also have stone walls, and you can get all of these within a landscape quite close to each other. So I don't know if this is true or not, but nearly 700,000 kilometres of hedgerows in Ireland. So very big resource for wildlife, for plants, etc. And if you were to think about hedgerows, tree lines and scrub, they're doing a lot of the different multifunctional ecosystem services that you'd like to think about. Storing carbon, they can help with soil formation, they can stop or can retain nutrients from heading into watercourses. Townland boundaries are a particularly culturally important feature of the Irish landscape. They can provide food for pollinators, and they can also provide refuge places for pollinators. It's an extremely important part of Irish biodiversity. But many times you'll go to hedgerows and you'll see that they've been left to grow up. So of course the function of hedgerows was to be stock-proof, and they would have been laid in the past or managed in the past. And we don't have that incentive anymore. Maybe a lot of the hedgerows are with post and wire fencing, etc. So question is, what does a good hedgerow look like in terms of biodiversity? There's many different ways that they can support different types of biodiversity, and many different forms of hedgerows are good for that. And if you're to go along a roadside, you can find that roadside verges very much imitate nice hay meadows if they're left to their own devices and not cut or regularly fertilised. And here you can see a tree line in the background, and this tree line is rotationally cut on about a 10-year cycle. It's got abundant resources there for pollinators and for other birds and other wildlife. There's a lovely grouping of diagrams on something called the Forum or the Farming for Nature website, and they have this nice grouping of how you can manage peatlands, how you can manage grasslands, how you can manage hedgerows better for biodiversity. You can see over here in the slice of the biodiversity pie, this type of system is pretty poor. So you have very scattered local tree growth. There's large gaps, and it's cut to a low height fairly regularly. So not giving much in terms of ecosystem services. And if you look on the right-hand side here, and there's the link there if anybody wants to get it, you can see a wider hedgerow, lots of different species, allowing sort of flowers in spring, berries in autumn, trim back only in small sections rotationally, livestock and shelter underneath that, and you're also giving a better chance for fauna and anything that might like linear woodland to use that, and you've got a larger piece of the biodiversity pie. Now to finish our whistle-stop tour of habitats in the Irish environment, we're going to look at heathland and peatland. And this picture I took near Delphi, and you can see it was obviously quite a cold day, but a beautiful landscape. And this type of landscape is very much dominated by heathland and peatland. So what's the difference between the two of them? In Fawcett, so Fawcett Classification Guide, the difference is this. Heathland has greater than 25% cover of ericaceous shrubs. So your heathers, your ling heather, your bell heathers. In peatland, you've got less than 25% cover, and it tends to be wetter, and you can see the ponding water in that situation. Now, blanket bogs, raised bogs, they tend to have the same types of vegetation present because they're both acidic, both very wet. Grasslands, there's very few grasses present in blanket bogs and raised bogs. Grasses just aren't going to be really good at surviving in here, except for that grass that you can see there, which is Molinia, purple moorgrass. So generally speaking, you get grasses replaced by sedges. Mosses are extremely important, so they're a keystone species here. Without mosses, this whole system collapses. And here, this has got the terrible name of drowned kitten moss in this place, or in this location. You can't see there, but there's very small pieces of heathers and bell heathers, and you can see more there, sorry. And the water table is very close to the land surface. So think of your heathland and peatland having a gradation of plants that like very wet conditions to plants that like moderately wet conditions. So your Sphagnum cuspidatum there, brown kitten moss found in the wettest pool areas. Your sedges, your rushes like deergrass, etc., they're found in the medium kind of areas of wetness. And something like heather doesn't tend to be found in the wettest of conditions. It can group and be more common in drier conditions. And now to introduce potentially two phrases to you, the aquatellum and the catechellum. So if you're to do a transect or a kind of profile through peatland, what you have in the top few centimetres is you have the aquatellum. That's the living part of the bog. That's where your plants are rooted, your sphagnum moss is more commonly found, and that area there allows water and oxygen to penetrate through. But there isn't a huge amount of decomposition because of the acidic nature of the ground and the high water table. So in time, your mesotellum and your catechellum, these are where kind of very limited amounts of decomposition takes place. And this is where year after year after year, more and more material builds up. So your bog continues to sequester organic material, and when you sequester organic material, you're also sequestering carbon. And sphagnum mosses are the main component of that aquatellum, so they're a key indicator species. And this lovely diagram shows you here what they look like. Really, the main tip is the one that's the main photosynthetic part, so the one that's making the food. And here, these stem leaves, these stems can go down for quite a depth, and some of them can be, not producing any food for the plant and just starting to decompose. The sphagnum mosses themselves are very clever. They can hold up to about 20 or 30% of their, or 20 or 30 times their weight in water. And they have these empty cells which can fill up with water. And then you can see the green areas there, the chlorophyll areas, are confined to the edges. So why are bogs acidic? Well, it's because of sphagnum mosses. So sphagnums themselves aren't acidic, but they're very good at exchanging ions into the environment for the very scarce nutrients that happen to occur in bogs. And that's where they're really successful. They sweep up any nutrients that are going. So as soon as they put hydrogen ions into the environment, that increases the acidity of the surrounding water, which then forms this feedback loop where everything gets more acidic, and that's why bogs are acidic and sphagnum mosses keep them acidic. Sphagnum mosses can really tell you the story of the water table in a bog situation. So this lovely diagram, and I've put the link to the information where you can find it. Here's your water table, and We have hummocks and hollows. That's very common in bogs. In the kind of hummock area there, that's your drier, heathers, etc. Here in the wet areas, you're going to get your sphagnum mosses. If you have changes in that water table, say there's been drainage, you then start to lose that hummock hollow. You start to get infilling of ground or material in here, and it all evens out. And then you're losing those really wet locations. So you're losing your wet sphagnum mosses. As time goes on and your water table drops, you're really only getting, very small patches of sphagnum, if any at all. And then finally, as your water table drops, you really lose the ability for that area to hang on to those wet-loving species, and it's bog myrtle, dwarf shrubs, etc., and now it's become a heathland, and eventually that could become encroached upon by scrub, other pieces of scrub. Bog asphodel, so one of your characteristic species, it's pollinated by insects and rain, which is quite handy because a lot of rain falls in bogs. Ossifragum there, so Nartesium ossifragum means bone breaker, and I think in the past farmers considered that was responsible for a lack of condition in cattle and other livestock that were up on bogs. It's very clever. It doesn't like to be grazed, so it's got chemical defences that stop plants or stop livestock from grazing it. So that's a very quick overview of the main habitats that we will find in Ireland. What I want you to do is really look at the Fawcett Habitat Guide and understand the characteristic plants that are found in each of those different habitats.